Science fiction wasn't always just rockets and robots. During the Cold War, these stories became dangerous mirrors, reflecting things governments didn't want their people to see. Imagine a movie so bold that officials locked it away, or so unsettling it was chopped to pieces before release. Curious? You should be. Because today we're diving into the world of 12 Cold War sci-fi films that were banned, censored, or buried. And the reasons why might just surprise you. Stalker, 1979. What happens when a movie is so strange and unsettling that officials can't decide whether to celebrate it or bury it? That's the story of Stalker Andrei Tarkovsky's legendary Soviet science fiction film. Released in 1979, it wasn't banned outright, but it was heavily censored, delayed, and restricted in its circulation. And the reasons say a lot about how governments feared not just what films said, but what they made people feel. On the surface, Stalker is about three men, a guide called the Stalker, a writer, and a professor, who journey into a forbidden wasteland known as the Zone. At the heart of the Zone lies the Room, a place that supposedly grants your deepest wishes. It sounds like classic sci-fi, but Tarkovsky transformed it into something entirely different, a slow, hypnotic meditation on faith, truth, and the emptiness of authoritarian promises. The Zone, with its ruins and shifting landscapes, looked eerily like the wreckage of a failed utopia. Many Soviet viewers saw the allegory instantly. Was Tarkovsky suggesting that beneath the slogans and progress, the system was nothing but decay? Was the Room a metaphor for the hollow promises of power? The ambiguity made censors nervous. Production itself was chaotic. The first footage was reportedly destroyed, forcing Tarkovsky to reshoot much of the film. Rumors swirled that these accidents weren't entirely accidental. Once complete, the film sat in limbo, subject to endless debates among officials. It was finally released, but in limited runs, carefully monitored. Abroad, it was hailed as a masterpiece of philosophical sci-fi. At home, its reception was more complicated, celebrated by intellectuals, but treated with suspicion by the state. What makes Stalker fascinating is how little actually happens on screen. Long silences, endless walking, and whispered dialogue replaced action. Yet this very slowness was what unnerved officials. It gave audiences space to think, to reflect, to question. And in the Soviet Union, questioning was always dangerous. Today, Stalker is considered one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. Its censorship and restricted release only add to its legend. Tarkovsky turned a bleak, abandoned landscape into a mirror, and the government didn't like what it saw staring back. On the Silver Globe, 1988. What happens when a film is stopped mid-shoot by the government itself? That's the tragic and fascinating story of On the Silver Globe, a Polish epic directed by Andrzej Żuławski. Imagine an ambitious science fiction saga that could rival 2001, A Space Odyssey. Now imagine bulldozers literally rolling onto the set to shut it down. That's exactly what happened. The movie was meant to be the director's grand vision, an adaptation of his great-uncle's novels about astronauts who colonize a new planet, only to recreate the same cycles of power, control, and collapse that they tried to escape on Earth. It wasn't just science fiction, it was allegory. Żuławski's story was pointing fingers at how authoritarian systems repeat themselves, no matter how far you run. Authorities in communist Poland didn't miss the message. Midway through filming in the late 1970s, the Ministry of Culture suddenly declared the production wasteful and politically inappropriate. Crews were ordered to stop, sets were destroyed, and the partially completed reels were locked away. The director left the country in frustration, convinced his greatest work would never see daylight. But here's where history twists. A decade later, as political winds shifted in Poland, Żuławski was allowed to piece together the fragments. On the Silver Globe finally premiered in 1988, though it remained unfinished, stitched together with narration explaining the missing scenes. Audiences were stunned. Even in its incomplete state, it felt massive, bold, and unlike anything else in Eastern Bloc cinema. The censorship, ironically, made it legendary. By cutting it off, the authorities guaranteed it would be remembered as a lost masterpiece. Today, film critics rank it as one of the boldest science fiction visions to come out of Europe, precisely because it dared to challenge the system so openly. On the Silver Globe is proof that even broken art can echo louder than the polished propaganda of its time. and the story of how it was nearly erased only makes its strange, epic beauty even stronger. Repentance, 1987. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't aliens, they're leaders. That's the unshakable truth behind Repentance, a Georgian film that dared to question the dark legacy of dictatorship. Directed by Tengiz Abuladze, this wasn't a sci-fi blockbuster in the flashy sense. But make no mistake, it used allegory and surreal imagery in ways that placed it right alongside the most haunting, speculative films of the Cold War era. The story follows a small town where the body of a former mayor, modeled closely on Stalin, refuses to stay buried. Each time he's put in the ground, he mysteriously resurfaces. The townspeople are forced to reckon with the memory of his cruelty, and the question becomes unavoidable. How do you ever move on when the shadow of tyranny never really dies? The film's imagery is dreamlike, almost nightmarish. You see scenes that could have come from a surreal sci-fi world, long parades, grotesque ceremonies, the unsettling idea of a figure who cannot be silenced even in death. It was a direct jab at the cult of personality and the suffocating weight of the past. Not surprisingly, Soviet authorities shelved it immediately. To release a film openly criticizing the legacy of authoritarian rule in the mid-80s was unthinkable. The reels sat in vaults until the era of glasnost, when Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms cracked the door open. Finally, in 1987, Repentance was allowed to premiere. The response was electric. Audiences in the Soviet Union wept openly. Some critics called it the most important film of its decade. Others saw it as a national therapy session, finally confronting ghosts that had been buried for too long. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Hardliners blasted it as dangerous, claiming it threatened national unity. What makes Repentance extraordinary is its refusal to settle for simple answers. It suggested that the past must be faced, no matter how painful. That idea, presented through imagery as bold as any science fiction fantasy, was what made it too dangerous for censors to handle. Repentance isn't just a movie, it's a haunting reminder that memory itself can be rebellious. 33, 1965. Imagine making a goofy comedy that accidentally rattles the government. That's exactly what happened with 33, a Soviet satire directed by Georgi Danelia. On the surface, it looked like harmless fun. A small-town man becomes famous overnight when doctors discover he has 33 teeth instead of 32. The discovery launches him into celebrity status, complete with national honors and a brush with space-age glory. Sounds silly, right? And it was. But hidden beneath the humor was something sharper, a parody of Soviet society's obsession with ceremony, progress, and the cult of scientific miracles. The character, played by Yevgeny Leonov, is whisked from obscurity into a world of parades, accolades, and overblown promises. Suddenly, the entire system is bending over backwards to celebrate something that's basically meaningless. At first, audiences loved it. People laughed, critics praised its humor, and it seemed like another light entry in the Soviet film catalog. But then officials started to notice the subtext. The film's portrayal of cosmonaut culture, with its mock ceremonies and exaggerated pride, looked suspiciously like satire aimed at the state itself. And in the tightly controlled atmosphere of the 1960s, mocking anything connected to the space program was a dangerous line to cross. Within months of release, 33 was pulled from circulation. It vanished from theaters, screenings stopped, and the film was quietly banned. For decades, it lived in semi-obscurity, whispered about by those who remembered its brief run. Only during Glasnost in the late 1980s did it reappear, when the censorship thaw allowed once-forbidden works to resurface. What makes 33 so fascinating is how harmless it seems on the surface. It's a comedy about teeth, after all. But the reaction proves just how fragile governments can be when confronted with laughter. Sometimes satire stings more than direct criticism because it makes power look ridiculous. And for the Soviet Union, that was a punchline they weren't ready to hear. The War Game, 1966. What if a movie about nuclear war was so realistic that it was locked away for almost 20 years? That's the story of The War Game, a British film directed by Peter Watkins. Produced by the BBC, it set out to show what would really happen if a nuclear strike hit Britain. But instead of futuristic laser beams or heroic scientists, it delivered cold, unflinching realism. Shot in a documentary style, the film follows ordinary people in Kent as the unimaginable unfolds. You see families scrambling for food, homes reduced to rubble, and children wandering dazed through chaos. There are no heroes here, just everyday citizens trying and failing to survive the unimaginable. Watkins filled the screen with haunting images that felt ripped from real newsreels, and that was exactly the problem. When executives at the BBC saw it in 1965, they were horrified. They feared it would panic the public, demoralize the nation, and stir up political outrage. The government applied quiet pressure, and the result was clear. The war game was banned from television. Instead, it was shelved, hidden from the very audience it was meant to reach. Ironically, the ban only amplified its reputation. The War Game won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1966, despite never airing on TV. Critics abroad hailed it as one of the most chilling portrayals of Cold War fear ever put to screen. Audiences who managed to see it in limited screenings described it as unforgettable, disturbing, and uncomfortably close to reality. Finally, in 1985, the BBC relented and aired it, just as the nuclear debate was heating up again. Viewers were stunned by how fresh and frightening it still felt, 2 decades later. The War Game proved that sometimes the most dangerous stories aren't the fantastical ones about aliens or distant planets. Sometimes they're the ones that hold up a mirror to reality, so clear and so close that you can't look away. That was what made it too powerful to broadcast, and too important to ever forget. The Time Machine, 1960. What if a Hollywood blockbuster about the future was really about the present? That's the brilliance of The Time Machine, directed by George Pal and adapted from H.G. Wells's classic novel. Released in 1960, it wowed audiences with dazzling special effects, sweeping adventure, and a story that spanned hundreds of thousands of years. But beneath the spectacle, it carried messages that made Cold War officials squirm. The film follows a Victorian inventor, played by Rod Taylor, who builds a machine capable of traveling through time. His journeys start close to home, leaping forward into the 20th century, where he witnesses wars, destruction, and humanity's inability to escape conflict. The parallels to the Cold War were impossible to miss. Viewers in 1960 saw the mushroom clouds, the endless arms build up, and the looming threat of self-destruction hidden in Wells's vision of the future. When the traveler jumps far ahead, he discovers the Eloi, a peaceful but passive race, and the Morlocks, who live underground and control the Eloi through fear. The allegory wasn't subtle. Many critics saw the Eloi as a metaphor for populations numbed into complacency, while the Morlocks represented the darker forces pulling the strings. It was a biting commentary on power, control, and the dangers of trading freedom for comfort. In the United States, The Time Machine was celebrated, even winning the Academy Award for its groundbreaking effects. But in some countries in Eastern Europe, screenings were delayed, restricted, or outright blocked. The film's clear warnings about war and societal collapse weren't messages authoritarian governments wanted amplified. The spectacle of civilizations collapsing under their own arrogance hit far too close to home. What makes The Time Machine endure isn't just its adventure, it's the way it blended spectacle with allegory, thrilling audiences, while quietly asking them to reflect on their own future. The fact that it faced resistance abroad only proved its power. By dressing Cold War anxieties in the costume of time travel, George Pal created a movie that still resonates today because the fears it touched haven't gone away. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, 1964. Can comedy be more terrifying than drama? Stanley Kubrick thought so, and Dr. Strangelove proved him right. Released in the mid-60s, this black-and-white satire turned the unthinkable nuclear annihilation into absurd comedy. It was bold, hilarious, and deeply unsettling all at once. And for that reason, it didn't play everywhere. The film's plot is almost too wild to summarize with a straight face. A U.S. general loses his grip on reality and orders a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. The president, his war room staff, and a gallery of bizarre characters scramble to stop it. What follows is a razor-sharp lampoon of military pride, political blunders, and the terrifying idea that the world's fate could rest in the hands of deeply flawed individuals. Audiences in the West laughed nervously, recognizing the truth behind the jokes, but not all countries found it funny. In Spain, still under Franco's authoritarian rule, Dr. Strangelove was banned outright for mocking authority and undermining the seriousness of the military. In other nations, scenes were cut or altered. Even in the United States, the film was controversial. The Air Force refused to cooperate with Kubrick, and some critics blasted it as unpatriotic. What made Dr. Strangelove truly dangerous was its tone. Instead of lecturing audiences, it made them laugh at the very people trusted to prevent catastrophe. That laughter was subversive. It stripped away the dignity of generals and politicians, replacing it with clownish incompetence. And once you've laughed at power, it's hard to fear it in the same way. Decades later, Dr. Strangelove is hailed as one of the greatest films ever made. Its ban in some countries only highlighted how sharp its satire really was. When governments fear a joke more than a sermon, you know the comedy has cut deep. Kubrick didn't just make people laugh, he made them think about how fragile human survival really island. 1984, 1956. Turning Orwell's novel into film was always going to rattle censors. The 1956 British adaptation of 1984 brought to life the bleak world of Big Brother, thought control, and endless surveillance. While the novel was already infamous, the film's stark black-and-white visuals gave those ideas a new punch, and authoritarian regimes were not about to let their citizens watch it. The story, faithful to Orwell's vision, follows Winston Smith as he struggles in a society where every move is monitored and independent thought is a crime. The bleakness of the sets, the drab costumes, and the hopeless tone made audiences squirm. This wasn't escapist sci-fi, it was a warning, and that warning was taken seriously by governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In the Soviet Union and its allies, the film was forbidden outright. The allegory was too obvious. A state that rewrites history, erases dissent, and crushes individuality was not something they wanted citizens comparing to their own reality. In some Western countries, the film was shown, but often in heavily edited form, cutting or softening the harshest parts of Orwell's vision. Even in the UK, there were heated debates over whether it was too bleak for television audiences. What made it controversial wasn't just the dystopian setting. It was the uncomfortable mirror it held up to the world. Orwell had written his book as a warning about totalitarianism, but watching it on screen in the Cold War era, many viewers couldn't help but see the parallels to their own government's obsession with control and secrecy. The censorship only made it more iconic. By trying to erase it, regimes confirmed its power. Decades later, the 1956 adaptation remains an eerie, stripped-down piece of Cold War cinema, overshadowed by later versions but still essential. It's proof that dystopian sci-fi doesn't just imagine the future, it exposes the present. And for censors, that was too much truth to handle. First, Spaceship on Venus, 1960. What happens when even a space adventure gets tangled in politics? That's the story of First Spaceship on Venus, also known as The Silent Star, a film co-produced by East Germany and Poland in the early 1960s. On the surface, it looked like a classic space race epic. A multinational crew of astronauts travels to Venus to uncover a long-buried mystery. But hidden inside, this story was a message that made censors uneasy. The film begins when a strange spool of alien tape is discovered in the Gobi Desert, hinting at advanced technology from Venus. A global coalition launches a mission to investigate. On Venus, the crew discovers ruins of a destroyed civilization, one that had obliterated itself with devastating technology. The lesson? Weapons of mass destruction could wipe out an entire world. For Cold War audiences, the allegory was obvious. In its original cut, the film carried strong anti-nuclear undertones. It warned against the unchecked race to stockpile destructive power. That message played fine in Eastern Bloc countries that wanted to critique the West. But when the film was exported, things changed. Western distributors chopped up the script, altered dialogue, and reshaped the story into a pulpy sci-fi adventure that downplayed the anti-nuclear message. In the United States, it was released in a heavily edited dub, stripping out much of the original intent. Meanwhile, in the East, officials were nervous that audiences might also interpret it as a jab at their own ambitions. While not outright banned in the Soviet sphere, screenings were limited, and it became one of those films shown carefully, often in edited form. The heavy-handed reworking turned what could have been a bold anti-war statement into just another monster on Venus yarn. Today, First Spaceship on Venus has regained attention as a fascinating artifact of Cold War cinema. It's part earnest plea for peace, part victim of censorship tug-of-war. Watching both the original and the Americanized versions side by side shows just how much politics shaped even our visions of outer space. Case for a Rookie Hangman, 1970. When allegory cuts too close to reality, censors panic. That's exactly what happened with Case for a Rookie Hangman, a Czechoslovakian film directed by Pavel Juracek. Released in 1970, this surreal, dreamlike sci-fi adaptation of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels was supposed to be playful. Instead, it was banned almost instantly, locked away for nearly 2 decades. The story follows Lemuel Gulliver, who wanders into a bizarre land filled with contradictory rules, endless bureaucracy, and authorities who seem both comical and terrifying. While based loosely on Swift's satire, the film leaned heavily on surrealism and absurdity. Characters speak in riddles, laws change without reason, and the protagonist becomes trapped in a nightmare of red tape and doublespeak. To the casual viewer, it looked like a quirky piece of experimental cinema, but to censors, the message was unmistakable. This was a thinly veiled attack on the suffocating bureaucracy of communist Czechoslovakia after the Prague Spring had been crushed by Soviet tanks. The film's portrayal of a system where logic collapses and individuals are ground down by authority hit far too close to home. Officials acted swiftly. The movie was banned, Juracek was blacklisted, and Case for a Rookie Hangman disappeared into the vaults. For almost 20 years, hardly anyone saw it. Only in the late 1980s, as communist regimes started to loosen their grip, did the film resurface. By then, it was recognized as one of the boldest works of the Czech New Wave, a movement defined by its creativity and constant battles with censorship. What makes Case for a Rookie Hangman so remarkable is how timeless it feels. Its surreal, looping logic echoes the frustrations of anyone trapped in an oppressive system where rules exist not to guide but to crush. By banning it, censors confirmed exactly what the director was saying, that power fears being laughed at even more than being opposed. Sex Mission, 1984. What happens when a comedy about the future becomes a threat to the present? That's the strange tale of Sex Mission, a Polish sci-fi satire directed by Juliusz Michalski. On release, it became a massive hit in Poland. But in the wider Eastern Bloc, officials were far less amused. The premise is wild. 2 men volunteer for a secret scientific experiment and wake up years later in a world run entirely by women. On paper, it sounds like goofy entertainment. But beneath the laughs lay biting satire. The film mocked authoritarian systems, gender politics, and the absurdity of rewriting history to suit those in charge. It suggested that any system, no matter how utopian it claimed to be, would eventually twist into something controlling and ridiculous. In Poland, audiences devoured it. People saw through the futuristic costumes and comic setups to the real target, the rigid bureaucracy and censorship of the communist state. The film's jabs at rewriting history echoed how the regime itself erased inconvenient truths from textbooks and news reports. That satire was too sharp to ignore. When distributed to other Eastern Bloc nations, censors intervened. In the Soviet Union, the title was changed to The New Amazons, and parts of the film were cut to soften the satire. In some republics, screenings were blocked entirely. Officials feared that the humor, once unpacked, would inspire audiences to question not just the future, but the present system they lived under. The censorship only made it more legendary. Fans smuggled bootleg VHS copies, turning it into underground gold. Decades later, Sex Mission is remembered as one of Poland's most iconic films, a rare blend of sci-fi, comedy, and biting political commentary. What's most telling is that even a playful premise became a political flashpoint. When laughter exposes the cracks in authority, leaders panic. Sex Mission showed that humor might just be the sharpest sci-fi tool of all, and that's why it couldn't be left untouched by censors. Red Dawn, 1984. Sometimes the loudest movies face the harshest bans. That's the case with Red Dawn, John Milius's explosive Cold War fantasy. Released in 1984, it imagined what would happen if the United States were suddenly invaded by foreign forces. Instead of soldiers, the heroes were teenagers from a small town who grabbed hunting rifles, retreated to the woods, and fought back. It was pure pulp, but also pure provocation. On the surface, Red Dawn looked like patriotic action. Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, and a crew of young stars became guerrilla fighters, calling themselves the Wolverines. They spray-painted their name on captured equipment, ambushed enemy patrols, and transformed from high school kids into hardened rebels. For American audiences, it was thrilling, even cathartic. At the height of Cold War fear, here was a story where ordinary citizens fought back and won. But in the Eastern Bloc, it was another story entirely. The Soviet Union and its allies banned the film outright. Why? Because the invaders were blatantly modeled on them. Soviet troops rolling through small-town America, Cuban allies parachuting in, tanks crushing Main Street. The message was too clear to miss, and officials decided their citizens didn't need to see themselves cast as villains in such a lurid fantasy. The ban was total. Even in the West, Red Dawn was divisive. Some critics dismissed it as over-the-top, a hysterical fever dream that stoked paranoia, but audiences didn't care. They packed theaters, cheered the Wolverines, and turned the film into a cult classic. The controversy only fueled its popularity. The more some critics sneered, the more fans embraced it as a symbol of defiance. Looking back, Red Dawn feels less like realistic sci-fi and more like a time capsule of Cold War anxiety. It was brash, unsubtle, and unapologetically loud. But its banning abroad showed exactly how powerful pop entertainment can be. When a movie makes governments nervous, you know it has hit a raw nerve. Red Dawn may not be subtle, but it proved that even pulp fiction could shake the world during the Cold War. So what do these 12 films teach us? That science fiction wasn't just about aliens, rockets, or distant futures. It was about power, paranoia, and the truths that leaders didn't want audiences to see. From animated shorts to bombastic blockbusters, these movies were silenced because they dared to speak too loudly. Which of these Cold War sci-fi relics do you think deserves a revival today? Drop your thoughts below, hit like, and subscribe for more hidden cinema stories.